Welcome to the MSU Horticulture Gardens. We're going to try to go on a virtual weed walk today, so we're going to walk around the gardens and see what kind of common weeds we can find and how to identify those. So come on. Right here we have a common species. Some people might think that it's a clover at first because it has these trifoliate leaves. This is actually yellow wood sorrel. It has heart-shaped leaflets. So unlike the true clovers, those have more rounded leaflets. These ones are heart-shaped. It also produces these nice yellow flowers this time of year. You can see that it has a hairy stem. It can be growing upright like this plant. There's another one called creeping wood sorrel, which behaves in a similar fashion, but it does more prostrate and creeps along the surface. Both of these are also examples of edible weeds. They form their seeds, I don't think there are any yet, in these pods, and the pods will forcefully eject the seeds, and that's how it's able to spread. And so if you have one plant, likely next year you're going to have many more. So this is yellow wood sorrel. Here in this garden bed we have a couple examples of some fairly common weeds that we see. The first one I think is especially common in areas where things are really well watered, and you would see this in both ornamental beds, vegetable beds, lots of different places. This is called common purslane. Common purslane has a very fleshy, succulent looking leaf. It's an annual species and grows very prostrate to the ground. And this time of year, often you'll see it producing very fine yellow flowers because it's trying to put out the seeds. But you can see it's kind of got a purplish stem and then these very succulent leaves. Purslane is edible, so if you have a lot of it, you might even want to try it in your salad. Another thing that we have growing here, very close to the ground, very prostrate, is called carpet weed. So you can see that there. Carpet weed is putting out little tiny flowers right now, and at each node that's laying along the ground, it's kind of creating almost this rosette of leaves that are coming out in sort of a circle pattern. And this is another annual species. Not super common, but I do see it, and it's one that's like mat forming. So this is called carpet weed. Here we have a somewhat common annual species. This is one of our pigweed species. This particular pigweed species is tumble pigweed. So as it grows and continues to get bigger, the leaves will actually become a little bit smaller, and it will take on an appearance of a tumbleweed. And that is one of the ways it can reproduce. Once it dries out, the stems would break and it can roll along and reproduce. All of the pigweed species are annual. Many of them have a glossy look to their leaves. Sometimes, depending on the species, they may have a red tinge to the stem. We have other examples such as redroot pigweed and Powell amaranth and smooth pigweed. Those are ones that are commonly found in Michigan. The differences kind of are in their leaf shape. So this one has sort of a longer petiole and a more elongated leaf. Some of the other redroot and Powell amaranth species have more of a kite-shaped leaf. A lot of these amaranth species are edible. You can eat the leaves. Some people use different amaranth species for the grain. They all have alternate leaves, so that means there's one leaf coming out of each node and it's kind of climbing the stem, versus the plant with opposite leaves, which would have another leaf coming out on the other side here. So this is one of our pigweeds, again an annual, so it's going to start trying to flower here anytime soon. It produces a very small black seed, and then when that falls to the ground, that's what's going to perpetuate this in the future. Here by this drain, we have a very common perennial species. This is one of the thistles called Canada thistle. The way that I know it's Canada thistle has very pokey leaves that look like "don't touch me," right? Which is true of bull thistle as well. But I know that this is Canada thistle, the perennial, because of the way that we have the plants here. We have a central portion with several plants, and then we have some kind of forming this colony all around here. And that's because this perennial reproduces by rhizomes. So these are underground stems, and I don't know, I'm not able to pull up the entire rhizome, but As you can see here, I pulled up a good portion of it, that very likely these two plants are connected, and that's how it's reproducing and spreading this colony. Now, these can be very difficult to get rid of with tillage because chopping up these rhizomes and moving them around can actually make the problem worse. If this were in a sunny spot, it would probably already be flowering, and it produces a pink flower, which I'll show you a photo of. But this is Canada thistle. Again, if you see several little plants all together, that's a good indicator that it's Canada thistle. Bull thistle, which I'm not sure if we'll find, is usually more solitary because it only reproduces by seed. It's a biennial. And so we don't see this colony forming like we do with Canada thistle. Here we have a couple different species that I want to talk about that are fairly common. You can see over here there's Canada thistle, which we already talked about. But here we have one of the solanaceous weeds. So again, it's related to some of our vegetable crops like potatoes and peppers. But this one is called Eastern Black Nightshade. Now, the members of this family are often easy to pick out. Maybe not to distinguish from each other, but to pick out, because there are certain insects that will often chew these little holes in there. And a lot of times that's an indicator to me that I have a solanaceous plant. So which one is it? Now, Eastern Black Nightshade typically has like these spade-shaped leaves. You can see here. Often when it's young, you'll see that there's purple coloration to the underside of the leaf. Now it's kind of faded in this one, but it is more purple than some other leaves that we will see. The other thing is they really kind of have a nasty odor to them. So if you were to rub this between your fingers and smell it, it does not smell very good. Now, this plant is just starting to reproduce. It's an annual, so it needs to make some seed. There's little tiny flower buds here. It's going to produce sort of a cluster of little tiny white flowers, maybe sometimes a little bit purple, and then those are going to turn into green and then dark purple berries, and that is very characteristic of Eastern Black Nightshade. Another species that we have growing here, more prostrate to the ground, is another annual. This one is called common chickweed. Now, common chickweed typically grows as a winter annual, so it's starting to come up this time of year because it's late summer. Sometimes it'll come up in the spring. This particular plant looks like it's going to try and flower before winter gets here. It's only an annual, so it only really gets one shot. If it hasn't flowered yet, it can overwinter vegetatively, and then it will flower and produce seeds early in the spring. But here we have one that maybe is kind of a little more cosmopolitan. It may have came up in midsummer and is now trying to reproduce quickly before the winter. The chickweed species have opposite leaves. So you can see there's two leaves coming out of the same node here. It's very characteristic. It's got this sprawling stem, but they're not stolons. They don't have roots coming out of them. It's just going to create a large mat. When it does flower, it produces these very dainty white flowers, and you can see that it has very pointed leaves here. So this is very characteristic of what common chickweed looks like, and it, as the name would imply, is a pretty common weed that we have here. This is another one that's edible too. I don't particularly care for the taste of it, but you can eat it fresh or sauteed or in soups and things like that. Okay, here we have a very common garden weed. Some may think this is a weed, some may disagree and say that it's not a weed, but this is common milkweed. And oftentimes, common milkweed can be seen growing in sort of colonies like Canada thistle because it reproduces by rhizomes. It also does produce seed, but you can see that there's several individuals here and here, and then some more coming up back here. So that's sometimes an indicator that you have common milkweed. The other thing, as the name will remind you, is that common milkweed produces a milky sap. So you can see it coming out the end there. Common milkweed is one of our weed species that has opposite leaves. So there's two leaves coming out of each node here, directly across from one another. The leaves have sort of a rough texture to them. They feel a little bit hairy, but you won't really see any hairs if you look on them, but they just kind of have a little bit of a rough feel to them. And then sometimes you do end up with an umbel-like flower that's often pink in color, and then it turns into seed pods after that will release their seed with the fluffy white pappus, sort of like a really big dandelion seed. So this is common milkweed. Okay, so here we have a few more common weed species. These ones you're probably familiar with. The first one we have here has a white umbel flower. It's very dainty. This one is sometimes referred to as Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. It's a biennial species in the carrot family. In its first year of growth, it'll put out a rosette that has very dainty leaves. They have almost like a feathery, lacy appearance. And then in its second year of growth, it'll produce the flowering stalk, and then that's when you get the nice open white flowers. Some of these flowers have already bloomed, are in the process of producing seeds, so they've closed up tightly, and they have some green immature seeds on here. The seeds look really cool. They have these little spines on them, and that seeds are how this weed is going to perpetuate itself next year, because the mother plant is going to die as soon as those seeds are mature or we get a frost. Another common rosette plant here again that we have, you see in many different habitats. You might see it in the lawn, you might see it in the garden. Has these very long lanceolate leaves that are jagged on the edge and produces a very popular yellow flower in the springtime. This one is dandelion, and it's a perennial that reproduces by seed, but it will keep coming back year after year from that taproot. Another weed that we have that we've already covered back here is common milkweed again. You can again see the opposite leaves here and the milky sap if I were to take that off. This one is growing by itself, so more than likely this one came up from seed this year, and if it overwinters here and no one pulls it out, it'll likely start producing those rhizomes, and you'll have a little bit bigger colony of it here next year. Okay, here we have two different species growing side by side that could get confused with each other. They're both in the rosette form, so they're kind of like a dandelion where they have one point that's coming out of the soil surface, and then all the leaves are emerging from that point. It doesn't have a central stem where it has nodes that the leaves are emerging from like some other species. So the two species that we have here are common burdock, which is a biennial species, and then we also have curly dock, which is a perennial species, and I'll show you those a little bit closer. So burdock is in the aster family, so it is a closer relative of dandelion than it is of curly dock here. And common burdock is the one that will put up the little burr that gets stuck to your clothes or might get stuck to your dog's fur or something like that. But it does it in its second year. So here we just have the first year plant, and if I came back next year, I would expect to see a flowering stalk on these with a pink flower that then turns into that burr. It has a relatively large leaf, and this one has a little bit, just a very touch of purple coloration to the stem. The stem is very coarse. It has sort of ribs on it. And the leaf doesn't appear, it has fine hairs on it, so if you rub it, it does feel a little bit fuzzy. So this is common burdock. The other one is called curly dock, and it has a much narrower leaf. So here are the two side by side. Curly dock, again, I said is a perennial. It's in the buckwheat family. So it's related to other things like Pennsylvania smartweed and wild buckwheat. It has a very curly edge to its long and narrow leaf, which is probably partly how it got its name curly dock. Curly dock will produce a flowering stalk. It has a very dried flat seed on it, but it has a cluster of those dried flat seeds. So it almost looks like shriveled up grapes, except they're very flat and they're a red color when they're mature. And so that's how it can reproduce. Another thing that separates these apart is if you're able to look very close to the ground. A characteristic of the family that curly dock is in is a structure called an ochrea, which is sort of a papery skin covering where you have nodes. So that's more obvious in some of its other relatives, like the Pennsylvania smartweed and lady's thumb, where they have several nodes that are growing above the ground that you can see this covering on. But you can see it here on this rosette of curly dock, and you would not see that on the common burdock that we're looking at here. You can see there's a couple different weedy grass species that are growing in this patch, and you really notice them because they're different in texture and different in color compared to the rest of the lawn here. There are some typical culprits we find coming up in lawns. One of them back here that's more of a yellowish in color is actually not a grass species at all, but it's called yellow nut sedge, and sedges differ from grasses quite a bit. They don't have nodes where the leaves come out. The leaves are kind of coming out of the bottom portion of the plant. Yellow nut sedge in particular has a triangular stem, so if you roll that stem in between your fingers, it's going to feel like a triangle. So that's another difference. If you were to break this open, it's also not hollow in the middle, it's solid in the middle, and that's another way to tell it apart from the grass species. Here I can pick it out pretty easily. It's usually got leaves coming out in sets of 3, and then it almost always has a yellow coloration to its very smooth leaves compared to the grasses that we have here. The other big grass that we have here typically would suspect that this is a crabgrass species. This is kind of, I think, more rare what we have going on here, but the crabgrasses do have a wide leaf blade. Usually the coloration is a little bit different, and it's an annual species. Well, this is another annual species. This is actually called barnyard grass. It's something we usually see in agronomic crops, more often in vegetables. What's very unique about it is if you pull back the leaf away from the sheath, most grasses have what's called a ligule here. It's either a fine, like a membrane, or a fringe of hairs, but barnyard grass has no ligule, and so that helps separate it out. It also has a very flat, compressed stem. So here we actually have some barnyard grass growing, and kind of, to some people, looks unsightly, and so that's why they want to figure out how to get rid of it. Now here we do have a couple crabgrass species. You can again see that their leaf blades are wider than our turf grass, which is probably a Kentucky bluegrass. Sometimes people have a fescue. Here is another example of the crabgrass. So the crabgrass, I said grasses have ligules. If you pull it back, and I'll show you a close-up picture of this, but there is an example of the membranous ligule here. There are 2 different species of crabgrass. There's large crabgrass and smooth crabgrass, and really the main difference is smooth crabgrass has no hairs along the stem and leaves, whereas large crabgrass has a hairy stem and somewhat hairy leaves. The management for these are basically the same because they're both annual species, but this is a good example right here